right, so we're broadcasting now to all of our attendees, and we'll wait just a little bit while folks jump in. Here we go, we're getting some folks coming in. Perfect. Welcome everyone. We'll just give a little bit of time for folks to trickle in for this event. And we are currently trying to get ourselves live on YouTube, but having a little bit of technical difficulties, so I will be troubleshooting that once we get started with the panel. But welcome everyone to another Wednesday evening where we're doing our Fighting Back Lessons from AIDS for COVID-19 series. My name is Leigh. I am the Museum Operations Manager here at the Society, or in my bedroom representing the Society. And I do the program curation, and tonight we have a conversation with a wonderful panel of people who will be talking about treatment and research activism as it relates to COVID-19 and also what we can learn from the HIV and AIDS crisis. Our Executive Director, Terry Beswick, will be moderating the conversation, but I'm just going to give a little bit of housekeeping and a little bit of Zoom info for everyone who is in the chat right now. So speaking of the chat, you as an attendee have a couple of different opportunities to interact tonight. You have a chat button on the bottom of your screen. You can put comments in the chat. I see we already have some people talking in the chat, although it's going to only all panelists. So feel free to put any comments that you'd like, as long as they're appropriate to the conversation, in the chat by making sure that you hit all panelists and attendees if you would like it to be something that everyone can see. And if you want to send a message to just the panelists, you can also do that. Just make sure that you select all panelists. We'll be having a conversation, and then near the end of the evening, we'll do an open Q&A section. And so you can please feel free to utilize the Q&A function, which is one of the other buttons that you have. You can send in a question via this function, and we'll be able to see it and select it for answering. Please feel free to send questions throughout the entire evening. We may answer them in the course of our conversation, but that way we'll have a nice queue of them. And also, please, if you can, refrain from asking your questions that you want to be addressed in the chat, because if people are talking and commenting consistently, it's very easy to lose it in there. And then lastly, you have the opportunity to raise hand. When we get to our question and answer section, if you would like to contribute to the conversation verbally, you don't want to send a question in via text, you can press the little raise hand button, and that'll let me know as the moderator or the tech moderator that you want to contribute, and I can unmute you and you can ask your question. And please feel free to ask any questions, or if you have any concerns with the Zoom, send me a message in the chat. And with that, I will move it over to Terry to introduce our wonderful panel.
Great, thank you, Leigh, and thank you so much for doing all the work to put this series together every week. I know it's a lot like herding chickens, and not that you all are chickens, but yeah, thank you everyone on the panel for being here tonight. I'm just going to do a brief introduction. The GLBT Historical Society, first of all, I just want to make a brief pitch for the organization. We were founded in 1985, and our mission is to collect and preserve and to share our queer history. And we do that through a few programs. One is our archives in the mid-market neighborhood of San Francisco. It's one of the largest collections of LGBTQ historical materials in the world, and if not the largest, that's independently operated. And we also have a small museum in the Castro neighborhood. All of this is moving online now, and we have a lot of events like this every week, every month that are moving online. So please support us if you can, and you can do that at our website, glbthistory.org. Become a member. and we'd love to have you as part of the organization. So tonight, you know, this is part of our Fighting Back series. We've been doing this since the inauguration of Donald Trump. That was really the point of inspiration. And the idea was to bring together history with contemporary issues. And so basically to look at a hot button, if you will, contemporary issue through a historical context. In the last few months since shelter in place went into effect, we went online weekly with this series and specifically wanted to look at the COVID crisis through the lens of AIDS. And so I'm hoping tonight that we're going to be able to learn some things. I know I will with this group. And I hope everybody has a chance to participate in this series going forward as well. There's a lot of interesting topics going forward. And we will archive this online on our website. So if you're seeing it as a recording, please feel free to share. So with that, I want to introduce our illustrious panel and really kind of just dig into this thing. And I'm going to just read everyone's bios really quickly, and then we're going to plunge in. But before I do that, actually, I just want to note that today is the day that Larry Kramer died. And I feel like that's the title of a play. And it's quite you know what, 10 minutes ago, George, I was looking for my shirt, my ACT UP shirt, and it's like buried somewhere. And I really just want to like acknowledge, you know, his pivotal role in all the work that we have done over the last decades around AIDS specifically, and he was always a point of inspiration to me. I always think of him and Marty Delaney in particular as being two of the most influential figures in my life. And so I think it's a huge loss. Actually, when I think about Larry, it's like, I think of somebody who fought really hard to live and really exemplified what it meant to be a fighter and a long-term survivor for all of us. So with that, I'm going to introduce our panel. George Carter has been an AIDS activist since he joined ACT UP New York, which was founded by Larry Kramer in 1987. George joined in 1989. He helped run the DAAIR, is it just pronounced DARE? I don't even know, and ran the New York Buyers Club, two buyers clubs that focused on integrative approaches to managing HIV, hepatitis C, and antiretroviral side effects. He started FIAR in 2001 and has more recently been working on a list of potential therapies for treating SARS-CoV-2. Thank you for being here, George. Liz Highleyman joined ACT UP Boston in the late 1980s, and her experience as an activist inspired her to study public health at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. She has worked as a freelance medical journalist specializing in HIV for 20 years. She is currently the science editor for Pause magazine and covers HIV and now COVID-19 for the Bay Area Reporter. Thank you for being here, Liz. Brenda Lein was a Shanti volunteer in the late 1980s and early 1990s, providing practical support for people with AIDS. She also served as a member of ACT UP San Francisco and was a founding member of ACT UP Golden Gate. I think we have a couple of ACT UP Golden Gate veterans here I remember sitting at the table with. She helped to form World Women Organized to Respond to Life-Threatening Diseases, an organization for, by, and about HIV-positive women. Lein also held the dual positions of Director of Information and Advocacy and Director of Project Immune Restoration at Project Inform. Most recently, she served as the Program Director for the Delaney AIDS Research Enterprise to Cure AIDS, a large government-funded international multi-center bench-to-bedside research effort. She is currently the President of the Linda Grinberg Foundation for AIDS and Immune Research, which funds cutting-edge immune and HIV/AIDS cure research. Matt Sharp is a long-term HIV survivor and a founding member of ACT UP Golden Gate. He has a 30-year history monitoring treatment and research for HIV, advocating for ethical, speedy, and comprehensive drug development, and has participated in over a dozen clinical trials. He resides in Berkeley with his dog, Betty. Is Betty going to make an appearance tonight also? Jeff Taylor has been...
On the floor.
Okay, yeah, Tiki's over here too. Jeff Taylor has been HIV positive for 38 years. He has served as a community advisor to many research groups, beginning with the UC San Diego Antiviral Research Center Community Advisory Board and the Community Scientific Subcommittee of the AIDS Clinical Trial Group. He also serves on the AIDS Treatment Activist Coalition's Drug Development Committee, which meets regularly with pharmaceutical companies and the FDA on HIV drug development issues. Locally, he produces a monthly treatment education series on HIV treatment issues for HIV patients and providers, and serves as the director of the Palm Springs HIV and Aging Project to conduct community-based research on aging and HIV. Wow, what a great panel. You know what, you guys, I sent out this long list of discussion questions for us to dig into, and I have no idea how we're gonna get through all of this. There's so much that we could potentially talk about. And I thought we would just like at first maybe do a quick go around and just talk about your work with relationship in particular to HIV and AIDS and COVID-19. So can you just like, or whatever you want to talk about Larry, I don't care. Who wants to go first? Brenda. I'm going to go around the circle as it's shown on my screen, so I'm going to unmute you.
Okay. I was hoping you wouldn't pick me first.
Sorry, you can go last next time.
So I'm not exactly sure what you want us to say. I'm not working in COVID-19, so I really can't speak to, I'm not sure exactly what you wanted here, but what I will say is I think as an activist, and a community health educator, I think what's been weighing on my mind most lately is the AIDS activist role, confronting, addressing, and mitigating the impact of denialists. And I've been thinking about that a lot lately, as well as my role at Project Inform as an educator and an activist in combating misinformation in general and the impact that that had on people's lives, like the cure of the day, you know, the coffee enema, the what have you, and how in this information age, the presence of both of those influences are amazing, startling, and I think overwhelming for everyone. So I'll put it out that that's what's been on my mind, and it's an area that I spent a lot of time working on in HIV, both in the courtroom, combating the negative effects of the denialists and how they disrupted our community in San Francisco, as well as an information provider. So yeah, I'm kind of interested in talking about that a little among the many other things we have to talk about. So I'll pass it.
Great. Yeah, I would just say, you know, I mean, I kind of define work in a very broad sense these days. And I see you engaging online, and maybe that's work in some ways. So with that, Matt, can we go to you, my friend?
Sure. Hello, everybody. Yeah, so I kind of feel like Brenda and I don't feel like directly working in activism with COVID, although, you know, like all of us do and like all of us are interested in, we follow what's going on. And Brenda, certainly, I mean, my God, your Facebook posts are amazing, and Liz as well. But in any case, so I'm following everything, and I don't feel like I'm sitting at the table, which is like what we always promoted as AIDS activists, that was the most important thing for us, to become involved as people living with HIV and as activists and as people working with people living with HIV, that we needed to be at the table to provide responses and to be a part of, you know, what's going on and to give direct input. And so I wanted to say one thing about that is that I was on a community advisory board with the Defeat HIV CAB up in Seattle. They're a part of the Martin Delaney Cure research collaboratory, and they had a webinar, a Zoom webinar on a couple of ACTG trials, AIDS clinical trial group trials, or on COVID. And Well, I wanted to say one thing about it. Interestingly, we were all AIDS activists, or are AIDS activists and AIDS cure research activists. And we sat, one of the questions that came up was, well, how do we involve people with COVID to sit at the table? I mean, who are these people? And that just kept bringing in my mind about what that really means to activists and to the researchers, and what is the most contribution we can make as patients of COVID to that process. And it's an interesting dynamic, sort of, and it's different than it is with people with HIV. So in my mind, my quick answer was, and I would say, it's people who have direct relation to the research and may be impacted by COVID, but it's also their allies and people who have the information and understand what it's like and can clearly communicate to the researchers. So that's all I want.
Great, thanks, Matt. I'm going around my circle here on my screen, and next I see Jeff. I'm gonna unmute you. Gonna try to unmute you.
There we go. Sorry about that. So, you know, I live in Palm Springs, which is kind of God's waiting room for old gay men with HIV. So I kind of see everything through that lens because A, I'm living it, and so is everybody around me. And, you know, the research we've been doing with the HIV and Aging Research Project has really focused on the psychosocial impact of long-term survivorship, because that's the number. We did a series of focus groups, and that was the #1 issue for both our providers and the patients. So we decided to focus on that. And then when COVID happened, we decided, okay, this is going to bring up a lot of stuff, right? There's going to be a lot of PTSD. And we very quickly put together a COVID needs and PTSD assessment that we put out there. And we've got some preliminary results already, and they've already been published in AIDS Behavior. And we're submitting an abstract to AIDS 2020. But what we're finding, gratifyingly, is that people are turning on the skills they used to get through HIV. And they're survivors because of that. And they're using those same skills, and they're being very adherent and compliant to the social distancing recommendations. They're not taking chances. But also, it's not affecting them a lot yet in terms of the PTSD. They acknowledge it, it's there, but it's not really making them depressed or sending them into a tailspin. But what we're concerned about is that a lot of these people are not just positive, which fortunately we're finding out doesn't seem to put them at much greater risk than other people. But a lot of them do have other comorbidities that do put them at risk, being diabetes, hypertension, kidney disease, and just being older, you know, on top of everything else. So these people are going to have to, at least for the foreseeable future, remain socially isolated to protect themselves as we open up, and we're going to start seeing second and third and fourth waves. I think we're in for some ugly realities in the next few months. And so they're going to have to kind of stay sequestered. And what does that mean? And will their resiliency last as long as it needs to? So what we've done is a couple of things. I started immediately when this happened. You know, we have monthly provider meetings that we couldn't do anymore for HIV providers. So we decided to do a Zoom COVID rounds for all the COVID treating providers here in the Coachella Valley. And that has been really well attended, very successful. We bring in, you know, people from the drug companies talking about their drugs like remdesivir or hydroxychloroquine with the studies, various assays. We've been tapping pure researchers like John Zaya down at City of Hope, who has pivoted like many to use his lab to create new assays. And the other thing we're doing is we applied for, we're partnering with an immunologist at UCI to create a cohort study of 100 HIV positive people over 50 and then 100 HIV negative matched controls. And this is going to be a longitudinal cohort that will probably start enrolling around August or September, with monthly visits to coincide with the beginning of the flu season, because we expect there's going to be a big uptick in seroconversions then. And we're taking all comers, so people who've already been infected, but also many of them won't. And it's kind of like a mini Max or Y study, right, to see what happens to these people over time. And we're going to be doing a lot of the same psychosocial surveys as well. One thing I think we're going to be seeing in the community, we're already seeing some of it, is COVID stigma, either because people are at risk or because they're not, you know, they're not at risk because they're younger. But you're seeing a lot of this playing out in a really ugly way in the media. So we want to see if we can, you know, capture that in our community and see what that means for people. And again, if you know, people's resiliency and the coping mechanisms they developed for HIV hold up over time, or if it'll start to wear on them and we're going to see people start to decompensate and experience more problems. So we're hoping that gets funded. We hear next week, actually. So fingers crossed that'll come through. But we remain, you know, on the forefront trying to do what we can to deal with this second epidemic. But it's really gratifying to see the researchers and the frontline physicians who were, you know, trained as ID specialists or immunologists really take up COVID in a big way. Many of you may know Rick Loftus from San Francisco, and he's really led the charge down here. And he's gotten himself on the evening news complaining about the lack of PPE and we need a strike force and contact tracing and all this stuff. So it's great to see kind of these old activists you know, sharpening their skills again and getting out there doing what needs to be done.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Amazing work. George, talk to us. What's going on? Talk to us about your work in AIDS and or COVID-19.
Okay, so yeah, just to briefly recap a little bit, when I started with ACT UP back in '89, I was first of all in a room with some of the most amazing people I've ever seen in my life. And Larry was occasionally there, and I was never close with him as other people in ACT UP were as close, but he was enormously influential. And so his loss today is deeply affecting. And it's kind of the other milestone we have today is that, you know, the United States hits over 100,000 dead from COVID, clearly underscoring how absolutely horribly the Trump administration has not managed this. And in those early days, I started to get involved with treatment data because in my earlier life, I'd gone to Carnegie Mellon and studied science. And so medicine and science didn't scare me so much. And I thought this is something where maybe I can contribute. And part of the treatment and data committee, we had a subcommittee called the pathogenesis subcommittee, and we studied how does HIV cause AIDS? And the more we understood how HIV caused AIDS, the more I began to look at, okay, well, there's therapeutic implications here that go beyond, at the time, what we had was AZT, and it kind of sucked. So that got me started in making this big set of tables of all the different kinds of treatments and interventions. And I basically didn't care what the origin of these treatments, you know, was it a drug? Fine. Is it a vitamin? Fine. Is it an herb? What's the evidence? And that kind of led me to today where when the COVID, SARS-CoV-2 began to become prevalent in the world, it immediately occurred to me that what we need is treatment. And if there's any kind of interventions that could help people that wind up in the hospital from progressing to more critical care, if we could keep people off of the vents, and or at the worst, if people do get on vents, if we could shorten the time as much as possible. So once again, I started making a list, and I've been publishing that list. And in the course of doing these things, in both cases, I've kind of found that nutrition plays actually an incredibly important role, not merely as adjunctive therapy, but we're finding, I mean, with HIV, the same thing is true. HIV is a gut disease. It gets into the gut, it screws up your ability to absorb nutrients, and those nutrients can have an impact on the rate of progression. My organization, FIRE, hooked up with Mount Sinai, and we did an NIH grant where we were doing meta-analysis of different kinds of so-called alternative treatments, and I hate that term. And we found that just a simple multivitamin in the context of adults with HIV not yet on antiretrovirals slowed progression enormously. And it's one of those interventions that should be a piece of standard of care. And unfortunately, it just gets dismissed or it gets lumped in with the other crazy ideas. So I've been steadily working on this list. Again, with COVID-19, there are several micronutrients, which we can talk about later, that appear to have an important role in either preventing disease from progressing to a more critical state, like vitamin D3. There's others that might help with managing the cytokine storm that happens when people do go critical. And then, of course, I'm also interested in drugs. As a person who lived with hepatitis C, I used a lot of those interventions to keep that under control. But once the drugs came along that were better than interferon and ribavirin, you didn't have to take that crap for a year that would maybe work, maybe not work, and then maybe leave you sick or sicker afterward. Suddenly there was these drugs you could take for 12 weeks, 1 pill a day, even if it was $1,000 for no good reason. But it pretty much got rid of the virus. And I jumped on it and have the white privilege, maleness, and connection with Mount Sinai that I got Doug Dietrich to get me that, even though I wasn't clinically eligible because my liver was in really good shape, because I'd been keeping it in good shape with all this, as my friend puts it, twigs and bark. So that's kind of my intersections that carry on through to today.
Great. Thanks, George. That's wonderful. Liz, can you wrap up our introductions?
Okay. Basically, my primary interest, both with, well, with HIV, I had a number of interests, but with COVID, it's primarily been sort of as a health educator and trying to convey good information and counter bad information. I was thinking back to the early years of HIV when, activists, informed ourselves. In some cases, people had to teach themselves the science and sort of served as health journalists, conveying the information through like GMHC treatment issues, and the San Francisco AIDS Foundation had a magazine, and that's how we got information out to our communities. But we had to work for it. It's like we took a lot of work to hunt down those medical journals in the university library, and you had to find a doctor to talk to, and that's very different today. I mean, you took some work to find the information, but once you found it, you could be pretty sure that it was correct. And today, the information is everywhere. There's a flood of it. It's not always written by people with any sort of a scientific background. There's a lot of informal freelancers and people on social media. And there's a relentless pressure, whether you're sort of in the journalism industry or not, to be the first person to write the article or the first person to share the article. And so that leads, of course, to a lot of, both unintentional misinformation, and then the worst problem of people intentionally spreading misinformation for whatever reason. And, it's great that anybody has access now largely to, whatever's on the internet, and medical journals are accessible free, at least during COVID. And, it gladdens my heart to hear my non-medical friends talking about cytokine storms and, asking the right questions. But it is a double-edged sword that, the information out there isn't always good. And I think, even more than that is it's politicized like it never was. And HIV was political too, with the arguments we had about, sort of anti-capitalist arguments against working with the pharma industry, and people that were more anarchistically inclined, saying people should have the right to try stuff without whether or not it's been through a randomized trial. But I think COVID has taken it to a new level. And it was just striking me the other day, like, 2 drugs are out there sort of, one's being touted by President Trump, the other's being promoted by Cuba. They're both perhaps modestly effective for some patients, anecdotal benefit, but haven't been proven in randomized clinical trials. So which one do you think holds promise? And that has to be more, I think, than just whether you're politically on the right or the left, because the evidence matters. And I think both liberals and conservatives can be at risk of overlooking or even dismissing science when it's not convenient or doesn't fit our ideology. So I think that's something that we have to be cautious about. And I think just the idea of sort of, we need to talk about the basics. It's like, not just say that, we need randomized clinical trials, but sort of tell people what they are, why a randomized clinical trial is different than, a few people seem to be helped when they took this. I don't think people know that. The idea about, how to read medical studies, and if you see something on a preprint server, that might not be the most reliable information. Never mind if you just saw somebody say something on Twitter or on Facebook. and, you know, conveying what we've learned over time about how to read and interpret statistics. I found that seems to be a real a barrier, especially things like relative risk, when, you know, you might have cases in a city go from you know 2 to 4 deaths, but you'll see that in the news and it's like the deaths doubled, it was a surge. It's like it went from 2 to 4, you know, and that's the kind of thing that I think just the very basics. And finally, I think, you know, just the idea that, you know, the scientists are learning along with the rest of us, and if someone, you know, information changes about whether to wear a mask, whether this drug works, it doesn't necessarily mean someone was lying to you or that there's a conspiracy to keep you in the dark, but it just means that understanding is evolving, and that's how science works, and that's a good thing.
Great, yeah. I heard a lot of really good stuff, and I hope that we can circle back and touch on a lot of the themes that were brought up. But I kind of want to like go first to some points that Liz raised, in particular in reference to how we all started around this, you know, AIDS in particular, HIV and AIDS in particular. I mean, I know for me, I mean, I was a theater major. I think most everyone here was probably a liberal arts major. And so I know, Matt, you were a dancer, right? And
I was a computer scientist.
Okay, well, that's a scientist at least. You know, but it was a different world in a lot of ways than it is today. But I wonder, maybe if we could just like establish a baseline for the people that are watching, either live or by recording, and just talk about, you know, what role did AIDS activists play with regard to the development of safe and effective therapies? You know, what agency did we employ in creating change or speeding up the drug development pipeline, or making sure that the right drugs were, you know, the whole research infrastructure? Can anybody like jump in and just talk about that on a real basic level for us? Brenda.
Okay, well, you know, I think the way that we influenced this was being involved with every level of the decision-making process. And this is something Matt brought up when he, you know, sort of talked about it in the introduction, how, you know, essentially we were at the table, and this is acutely different than now. Now, I won't say completely, because I was just on a call, and I can't even remember who it was with, of somebody who is in the AIDS vaccine trial networks, and now they're using that network to do some COVID studies. So those same AIDS activists who are the community advisory board are now at the table advising for that COVID vaccine research. So there are people at the table, and in terms of who is community, more so than in HIV, where you would, you know, say community is people living with HIV and their allies, but, you know, you really looked at someone who had personal experience living with the disease. Here, I think it's a little bit different, because every single person is at risk, and there's not these identified communities at higher risk. We're all at risk. I mean, there are identified communities at higher risk, first line responders, you know, but I think community is much broader here. So almost anyone you see on the street is community, and that's both a good thing and a bad thing, because we all have something to say, right? I was thinking how awesome it is that we come from all these diverse backgrounds. And I was thinking of Greg Gonzalez today, how, you know, I believe he was like a Russian lit major or something as well, and now an epidemiologist, and how this fueled our interest in science. And it's a great launch point to become interested in science. And there was a lot more room to learn then than there is now, because everything is so compressed. If you made a mistake as an educator or as an activist, it wasn't so immediately potentially deadly. I mean, people lived with HIV/AIDS for much longer. So everything is kind of compressed. And, you know, even that stigma issue that Jeff brought up, there's a stigma around COVID, but then you have the antibodies and you're gold, right? Like it goes away. So possibly. So I think that circling back around, the way that we made a difference was being at the table and involved with every level of the decision-making process. And we're not there, I think, with COVID. It's not that there's no one involved. It's there's a lot less non-scientists at the table.
So we were at the table, but nobody offered us a chair, really,
No.
right? We had to.
But we weren't told to stay home and social distance. So, you know, to get at the table, you may have a demonstration. I mean, I was thinking about it today. Can you call someone up and ask them for a meeting? You know, can you say, I'd like to come in and meet with your COVID research team? And they're going to say, do you really want to come into the hospital? Is that a safe place to be right now? You know, like, and so there's so many different barriers. Now you can say, but you could Zoom call. And I would say, I'm not sure what people have the time for and the openness for right now. That's
and I guess there was always that sense, if you were meeting with researchers, that there were people outside, whether literally or figuratively outside, you know, in the streets with picket signs that were sort of like opening that door and creating that seat at the table. Yeah, Liz.
I was just thinking, you know, there's also, I think the opposite is also true, that you can kind of get on Twitter and talk to one of the top experts in the field, which used to be hard to get to these people until you built up those relationships. And there's some experts out there that, you know, they're very forthcoming and they'll chat with you on Facebook and you know, engage with people who aren't scientists. So I think we're seeing both. It's just there's so much you know, there's so much information and so many more channels now. I think what Brenda said about, you know, you don't have time to make a mistake, you don't have time to learn, you know, you sort of put out what you see and read what you find and and you know, without necessarily having a lot of time to learn as we go.
Right, but you know, so for the people that are watching, I just don't want to assume that people understand the impact that AIDS activists had in terms of effects on the drug development process. Can anyone speak to that specifically?
Well,
yeah.
I mean, what I was gonna add to that previous, if I can, okay, is what I'm just gonna speak on what happened with me. Is I learned everything at a very incremental pace about all the science and, you know, clinical trials, the safety. When you brought up safety, there was a piece out on Kiyoshi Kuriyama that I commented on, who was an incredible mentor and taught us a lot about safety issues in complementary therapies. And that happened way long ago when I first started in all this work. And what I want to say is I don't see sort of that slowly developing incremental process around learning, around the science and around all the regulatory issues and around all the clinical trials that we had. And it's like Brenda said, it's all compressed. So it's hard, it's going to be hard to do that. But that's what I found. So I'm so thankful that I had all these years to learn all that. And at every step of the way, everything that I used and tried, I looked up and I researched, and I had people I asked about. Even the gene therapy trial I was in, we didn't know much about it. What did I do? I went around and asked Marty Delaney and Richard and other people that were involved whether this was, you know, going to be safe for me. And so I had people look up to and ask those questions. And then you built that on my sort of my resume of what I knew. And each way along the way, I think that built up to where now I can answer a lot of questions that I wouldn't have normally been able to answer. And that's what you don't see. We're probably not going to see that in the general population of people in the world. We're not going to have that ability. So that's just something to take a look at.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I think of the impacts that that we had as activists, it frequently was about like looking at a particular drug or a particular trial that was pertaining to either yourself or somebody that you knew, and then problem solving around that, and whether that precipitated a change to the clinical trial design or the access protocols through the FDA or whatever. But it was always like starting with an individual problem, and then hopefully it would be benefiting other people. Yeah, George.
One of the things you're reminding me of is the Countdown 18 Months, which was basically an effort around studying medications for opportunistic infections. And even though a lot of the OIs had treatments available, they were not very good in some cases, or not good enough. And so there were a lot of clinical trials. And that whole notion that we had 18 months to look at something, and even though the pressure was extraordinary, because that 18 months, how many people died? So in the same time that we had more time, we were still in that same sense of urgency and desperation, as we watched so many people die, possibly needlessly, because of the failure of the Reagan era and whatnot. Here we have something that's extraordinarily compressed, and there's, the shit hit the fan in January, and it began to become apparent in February that this was not just the SARS of 2003 or 4. This was not MERS. This wasn't just the influenza, another bad flu. And I had all those thoughts that maybe it would be that, maybe it would burn out, maybe it would just sort of die out like the other ones had, not this one. And so as a result, I first, because I became interested in treatment and management of this, I became interested in the hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin along with lopinavir ritonavir. In fact, I even had my doctor prescribe me Kaletra and oseltamivir, the flu drug, as a potential just in case. If I got it, I would at least have something to try. Mm-hmm. And that was based on data coming out of China. This was before the French study that's rightly been shredded, and before Trump got his grubby little fingers into things and wanted to make some money on it. And again, it was about the science. I really don't give a flying about Trump and what he thinks, because anything he thinks is either a lie or bullshit. And so it's not relevant. What's relevant is the science. And the science at first looked intriguing about that hydroxychloroquine azithromycin. The recent Lancet study where they looked at 100,000 people. There's another couple of studies in NEJM that was looking at about 2,000 people, and their outcomes were, did you die? Did you get stuck on a vent? And basically that combination doesn't do anything. Mm-hmm. And how could anyone know this? Nobody knew this back in early March, mid-March. All we knew is that this tsunami of horror was coming, and being here in New York, it's been particularly dreadful. And so I think that's kind of partly why there's just, the only way that anyone's going to be able to get involved with this is if they've had some of that opportunity to have a background, to have the mentors like Kiyoshi Kuramiya, who, God, I love that man. And all of us here on this, all those people that we all knew in those days, and of course we all had our fights and our arguments over the years, God knows it's true, but through it all, we survived. At least we're here to have this conversation. How many of our friends aren't? And how many of the people that are facing this crisis? I'm hoping that we recruit and that we'll get some really excited younger people, older people, whatever, jumping in on this and saying, what do we need to go forward? How do we address this pandemic in ways that helps basically kill it? I mean, the vaccine will be great if it comes, but how do we get therapies and interventions that save lives?
Okay, great. Thanks, George. I'm going to go to Jeff real quick.
Yeah, just to piggyback on what George was saying and alluding to what you talked about earlier is, how do we bring people in to be activists for this pandemic. And I think, you know, especially since community of colors, especially in places like New York have been hit so hard, we need to be hitting up the Moises Agostos and people like that who are already, you know, in the trenches. They have the tools and the experience to do it, and get them in the forefront and hopefully bring more people along with them, you know, from outside HIV. But I think we need to start with, pardon the expression, the low-hanging fruit, to people we know who have the skills and are part of those communities to do this work, because it's hugely important. And this should have happened yesterday.
Yeah, and Liz, I'm going to go to you, but I want to throw out a question. Maybe we'll get to it after you. But the question is really about, you know, this group that we have around the table, figurative table, as it were, came together, and a couple other people a couple months ago, and I just want to call this out. And we were like, I forget who convened us, but we were actually coming together as AIDS activists to just talk about what's going on with COVID, research and around treatments and vaccines. And, you know, we were kind of floundered with trying to figure out, you know, what is the point of insertion? How can we take the skills that we had and that we developed and honed around AIDS and apply them to this crazy new situation that is developing beneath our feet? And I'm hoping everybody can just like talk about, you know, we stopped meeting several weeks ago, and I know we got busy and we had trouble figuring out a time, and then it was, you know, it was just life. But how was that, participating in that and trying to figure out what we can do or what should be done? If you can speak to that, Liz. I was
actually going to speak to your previous question, which nobody else bid on. About.
That's okay. Then that'd be great, and then we'll go to the other one. Okay, that'd be great.
The you know, what ACT UP and the other AIDS activists did at the time and who they pressured, and it was largely you know, it was largely the Food and Drug Administration, the National Institutes of Health, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, all the same government organizations that are running the COVID response today, or in the case of the CDC, is being put in the closet today. But, you know, at the time, FDA drug approval was very slow. They tended to want to wait, you know, if somebody had to be, you know, treated for a long time, and the way they knew whether the drug worked was whether or not somebody died, and you had to wait for them to die. And with HIV/AIDS, sometimes it took a very long time. So advocates did a lot to try to speed up that process. Like, can we look at viral load? Can we look at people's CD4 counts? Other things they know as surrogate markers that can tell us how these things are going to work without waiting for people to die. And you know, the process has sped up incredibly. There haven't been so many HIV drugs approved recently, but I'm working in cancer also, and they've approved, like, it must be 24 drugs in the last, you know, since COVID. It's like they're working overtime, and all of it's based on these surrogate markers. And then you can see, you know, as much as we push for things to speed up, you can see where the problems are. Now, under a more sort of libertarian administration, the idea is, well, let's just let people try whatever, and hell, you know, like Trump said something about, like, yeah, what do you have to lose? It's like, well, potentially your life, and some of these things are dangerous, but there's always going to be that balance. And I think we saw that with AIDS activism. There were people who, after, you know, pushing for some of these HIV drugs to get approved fast, some of them ended up, you know, with time having side effects people didn't expect, and people, you know, started to pull back. But there was always a tension between the ones that's like, we need our randomized clinical trial, and the people saying, you know, no, let's continue to push things to move forward faster. And I think that tension still exists. But I will say that over time, you know, thanks in large part to the work of AIDS activists, I think the whole process is, you know, it's more transparent, it's faster, it's more streamlined, and I think that's, you know, people with COVID are gonna benefit from those changes, and it's largely thanks to the work that that treatment activists did, you know, 20 years ago.
Thank you, Liz. That's exactly what I was looking for. We just need to, I mean, for this group, it's kind of like stating what we know and we believe, and yet a lot of people don't really understand that. And I think, especially in popular media, it can be forgotten, you know, that things are different now than what we encountered with AIDS in the beginning. So you guys, we all got together and we were talking about COVID, and we're working in different areas now, perhaps, and we're trying to get up to speed. And Jeff, you are working in COVID directly now, I think more so, and Liz and George, you're doing your research, and we kind of got, I felt like we kind of got stuck. You know, it's like, you know, and I remember, Brenda, one of the comments you had was you felt like, you know, the researchers were moving so fast that even to talk to them felt like you were getting in the way a little bit, which is not the way that you used to operate. So around AIDS. So yeah, can you talk about that a little bit? I'm gonna unmute you. Okay.
Do you want me to talk about? I don't know who you wanted to talk about. Well, if I think about when we were meeting, so we had calls together, I think a lot of people on this group and a few others as well, just to talk about what can we do as activists and what were issues that are coming up. And I would say on some level, there was a fizzle as we try and get our heads around what we need to do. One thing that I would say that needs to happen is a lot of work needs to happen at the local levels. I mean, people are addressing what they need. I think of Nadine, and she's, finding people to make masks for her low-income clients at a dental clinic. They're finding ways to address social distancing guidelines by taking the backings off frames and using frames laying around a medical office as protective windows for clients who are coming in. I think we're at a phase like maybe we were when the KS Foundation was established, of people on a local level trying to solve their immediate needs based on kind of a crisis situation. People who in my county in Marin, they went in and were testing people in elderly care facilities, and none of the staff had PPEs, and the facilities had none available to them, and there was none to purchase. So they went to Nextdoor and started asking people to make those. So I think some of the immediate activism is solving local problems. I think some of the macro issues are starting to show themselves and become clearer as well. One thing that I found to be really useful is the UCSF School of Medicine's grand rounds, and being able to hear a wide range of experiences from ICU docs to people talking about more heady and distanced issues. And pondering the thought that we won't see a vaccine in the next year, maybe even the next 2 years. It's highly unlikely. And we have to really get our heads around that this isn't going to be over soon, that there is probably going to be a longer clinical trial pipeline for treatments as this thing either burns itself out or we move forward. And I think we're going to move into a place where our role is going to be clearer as sort of bigger meta activists in drug discovery and drug development, and that the short term is these local fires people are putting out, and the long term is grappling with a drug development pipeline. And I think George is doing an amazing job by putting together the framework to understand what's in the pipeline. But remembering that as AIDS activists, we were working with our friends, and we were there with them, and we were their medical powers of attorney, and we were in the doctor's office, and there was sort of a partnership. And here, if somebody gets really sick, they get to go into a hospital, and we're lucky if we get to see them through FaceTime, and our ability to advocate for them is severely compromised, and our ability to know what's working on the ground in an ICU is not there. Like
Right.
we have no clue. So it's a different environment. And I think we have to embrace that we know the drug development process, but nobody knows this disease. Nobody does.
Right.
So
Yeah, and that's and I just want to mention that Jeff had to jump off. He actually has that grand rounds, and we knew that he was going to have to jump off. I neglected to mention that at the beginning. So so he apologizes. I'm glad we had him on board, and we're going to bring him back again. And you touched on the PPE questions. I think that Jude was addressing in particular with people that are, forced to, go to work or in members of disenfranchised communities that are not given access to PPE. And I think you kind of talked about that, but I want to get to the other question from Jude in particular, which is around the denialism. And several of you actually talked about, the role of AIDS activists and how, we had to try to counter misinformation and try to get, accurate information out there. And Liz, you talked about in particular how we're in a whole new world right now with just so much stuff going on. And so how do we deal with that? How do we deal with, in particular, the denialists? We experienced denialism with HIV. It was sort of insidious. It never seemed to go away until the people that were denialists actually started dying off, and which is, a sad statement. But so how are we dealing with this now, George?
First, I would say that you should define what denialism is in each context. In HIV, it was the people who claimed that either HIV did not exist or it didn't cause AIDS. And the most, as you noted, a lot of the HIV positive advocates that I knew who believed that HIV was not harmful to them, every single one of them died of AIDS. In the context of today, the denialism, I think, takes the form of it's not a big deal, or it's a big hoax, or it's just the flu, and people don't have to worry. And the result is you see these large gatherings of people who don't have masks and they're not social distancing, and they're just basically ignoring it and having a good time. The scary thing is most of them will be perfectly fine. I mean, already 80% of people who get infected don't have a serious problem. They are either completely asymptomatic or they have a mild disease. So that can unfortunately fuel, I mean, it's a great thing. It's wonderful that it's not like HIV where 95% of people with the infection, if they don't get treatment, will progress to AIDS. I don't know how you deal with the kind of belligerent ignorance that is a part of our American culture. I think I would rather focus on the proactive things, like how do we deal with the structural racism that is more the issue here than the structural homophobia, although that's partly a problem. But in this particular pandemic, I think that the fact that so many people of color are dying of this disease is because of the structural racism that we live in. And tackling that is going to be enormously difficult. And if I could just tie that in a bit, I mean, this remdesivir, or as I like to call it, rammed up his rear, it's a marginally useful drug. William Hazeltine basically said he thinks it's not even any better than oseltamivir. They're over-promoting it. It's an IV drug that will only be available to a few people in hospital. And to the extent it's part of a treatment regimen, I'm fine with it, as long as it costs $1 a day. But we're living in a culture that has to push forward this particular drug because a big company has it, and there's lots of money that they want to make on it. And they want to charge thousands of dollars for something that costs $10, like they did with the sofosbuvir, the dipisphere drugs. And unfortunately, that precludes us getting to understand other things. There was a report that pointed out that the rate of the shortening of the time among people on treatment versus on placebo was better in a triple combination of beta interferon and ribavirin and, well, one other drug.
Kaletra.
No, it wasn't. No, I don't think it was Kaletra.
Okay, well, I saw was.
Oh, okay. Kaletra. I just was looking at so many of them.
No, I'm sure there's all of the above are no doubt being studied.
Right, and they are, and we're going to have more data, mostly from these observational studies, which all suffer from selection bias. And what that means is that because it's an open label study, even though they'll randomize, these patients get this, those patients get that, and that's part of a good clinical trial design, it's observational, so the physicians know who they're giving what to, and they're going to tend to give things to the sicker patients too, because they want to desperately try to do something. And so sometimes that makes a drug look not as good as it might actually be. But still, you want to see a signal that people don't go on vents, they don't die. And with remdesivir, it is a drug that does that. But in this country, we are so stuck with that kind of profiteering-based approach to drug discovery that we're going to lose out on understanding. You know, intravenous vitamin C is been shown very useful in sepsis. It reduces mortality. Very useful in the ARDS that comes with lung. And they are studying it in China. So we might have some clinical data. And this is the thing, we want evidence base. There's N-acetylcysteine or NAC that helps to calm down that cytokine storm. And they are looking at it at Sloan Kettering. They're doing a 6-gram IV study, but I don't know why that much, but
interesting.
There's some studies out there, but the majority of the studies are all going to be pushed down this pathway with remdesivir, because remdesivir, it's a real drug because it's made by Gilead, and Fauci's going to love it. And much though I like Fauci in many ways, this is one of the things that has always pissed me off about him, is that he has never embraced the notion of getting an evidence based around these other kinds of approaches that are not, whether it's a generic drug or a non-pharmacological intervention. And
yeah, the standard of care for all clinical trial comparison groups used to be just AZT. Remember that?
Yeah.
Or AZT in combination with something else, which was almost impossible to show any kind of results. Liz, I see your hand.
One thing I was gonna, I guess, a sort of a criticism of the AIDS movement. I think it, it sort of stopped with getting things through people with AIDS, which was what its job was. So it did a great job at that. But it didn't go further and try to get healthcare access for everyone, which is, I think, what we really need with this. With COVID, that's going to be a real difficulty getting access to treatments. It was a big problem with hepatitis C, as George has mentioned, and it was, we got AIDS drug assistance programs and various pharmaceutical patient assistance programs that will help people with a specific disease get specific treatments, but it wasn't just like everybody needs healthcare. And I think you're seeing that reflected with COVID, of course, both with people of color and the spread of the disease in the South. It's people who have not had good access to the healthcare system, states that have not expanded their Medicaid programs. And I think with every disease, the next pandemic that comes up, until we address sort of universal access to healthcare, it's just going to come up again and again, and it's not something we can just do disease by disease as they pop up.
Yeah, I wonder if, the trajectory of this disease and the development of effective treatments and/or a vaccine, whether within that time frame, that realization is going to rise to the level of creating public policy. It's an open question right now, but clearly, we were ill prepared for this epidemic, and that's the basis of it. The basis of it. I want to circle back to a question from somebody in our audience. Gwen asks, how do we know whether or not official sources are communicating reliable information? What is that critical thinking process that we developed, and how do we convey that to people?
Boy, that's a good one. And that's, I think the most frightening thing to me about that question is, who was it that said that they wanted to basically shrink government down to the point you could drown it in a bathtub?
Sounds like Goldwater.
No, it wasn't Goldwater. It wasn't Luntz either.
Guy.
Oh, Jarvis, maybe. Okay.
Whoever.
Yeah.
Trump has succeeded in that in an incredibly powerful way. through his sheer bumbling greed and his idiocy and his stupidity and his muzzling of anyone who disagrees. I mean, even though Fauci sometimes annoys me, the thing that I've always loved about the man, I loved when he would give a presentation about the pathogenesis of HIV, because, right, so clear, so lucid, marvelous. And he is very good at providing sharp, smart information if he's not muzzled. Robert Redfield at the head of the CDC,
not so much.
Not so much, yeah. And Azar is a pharmaceutical whore, pardon the French.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
how do you trust government when it's run by idiots who would prefer to promote things that profit them?
Yeah, I mean, I think Trump has made, I mean, yes, stupid and bumbling, but, but I think that the people around him have by design appointed people whose sole purpose was to shut down the agency that they were running, or to close it down. And you see that across government. So, and the pandemic office, I think in the White House, that was, or the desk or whatever it was. Matt, what are you thinking here?
So I'm just sitting here thinking about how, part of the reason why I'm really afraid. I'm really afraid of getting COVID. I'm susceptible for respiratory disease, and I'm 63 years old, and I've had AIDS for 30 years. So, I just sitting here wondering where the fucking urgency is when we have 100,000 people that have crossed the threshold of, dying. And I don't see that in a smaller group, and I don't see it globally, really. I don't know why. Is the world we live in, is it, because it's so compressed? Is it because HIV was in a much more cohesive community? I don't know why, but I don't see the anger. I don't see the urgency in getting something done. There are reasons why we can get a vaccine in less than 2 years. We can do that. If we have to force it. Remember what we forced in HIV to happen? We did it. So I'm scared. I'm so socially isolated that it's pathetic. If I get this COVID, it's all she wrote. It's bye-bye. But I'm not going to survive it. So I just want to say, I don't see that happening, and I wonder why. And I wish we could somehow mobilize that in our context.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, and especially on the day that Larry Kramer died. I think that's an important point to make. There's that sense of urgency, and I've been trying to figure that out too, and all those things that you mentioned. But Brenda, what do you think?
So, I feel a little schizophrenic in answering that question because, when I look at the pace of research and discovery in COVID, it's like light years accelerated over what we ever saw in HIV, and the sense of urgency by the scientific community and the medical community in general is something like I've never seen before, and I find it head-spinning, dizzying. So I do see that sense of urgency within the pace of discovery, and I do think that the Moderna drug, the vaccine research has moved again on light speed ahead. And why do I not think it will be approved in 2 years is because we've never had an RNA vaccine ever anywhere in the world approved. And I don't think it's going to be as simple as a flu vaccine. And I do think there's urgency, but I also think that there's this schizophrenia in that, on the one hand, with AIDS, we didn't see Reagan say the word for how many years, and there was this neglect and this silence. You see Trump talking about it all the time, but the reason I think it gets kind of back to Gwen's question of how do you trust what you're seeing, we never had the leader of the free world participating in medical misinformation the same way. So it's dizzying, it's different, it's a different context. Some things we can compare and say they're doing great. Other things I think are totally different. And you know, denialism wasn't invented with HIV. You can look at every epidemic, back to the Black Plague, and there were denialists and people touting, you know, snake oil, and every history of every major epidemic has those things. I think this epidemic, I understand it more having lived through AIDS, like, and I see the challenge of it, and I'm less, I think we have less to combat it with because the president is part of the problem, which that we've never had before. So that's kind of new.
Yeah. You know, so I'm going to jump to a question from Jude. Jude's come back with this and properly put it in the question and answer box. So I'm going to just read this off really quick because I think it really goes to the heart of some of this. What feels so challenging with COVID-19 is the pace of COVID spread and the required pace of our response. I've also been amazed at the ability of community to work together to solve problems. What is difficult to get ahead of is the emergency response so that community can engage to make contact tracing, vaccine delivery, and other mitigation. People seem to think that AIDS activists knew what to do. So, what advice would you give to people working in the COVID response, where the information is old at 1 or 2 weeks? And what in 2020 hindsight would you do so differently? And to the earlier question, I mean, yeah, I've noticed, you know, I'll have an idea, well, why don't they study this? Or why don't they look at that? And then I turn around and they're doing it, you know? Somebody is somewhere. What advice would you give to people working in the COVID response where the information is old at 1 or 2 weeks? And what in 2020 hindsight, this is going to be my closing question, but what in 2020 hindsight would you do differently, Liz?
I think to answer, I guess hopefully it answers both addresses both of those, but I think, you know, we saw in AIDS that there was, you know, there were the treatment advocates over here, and then there were the people that were doing a lot of the prevention work that was sort of separate, and the prevention work was not, as I would say, not as informed by science as the treatment work was. People were worrying about the wrong things. You know, there was various things that, you know, was sort of people thought was a good idea or whatever, but it didn't really have a lot of backing. You know, ultimately things like syringe exchange did get a lot of, you know, people did the science and found out that that was a great way to prevent transmission, but a lot of it was sort of seat of the pants. And I think, you know, in COVID, I think we're kind of seeing the same thing. Like the people that are working on the sort of community prevention, making masks and stuff, and the people on the sort of science side of it aren't, you know, aren't necessarily, well, I wouldn't say not talking to each other because they're looking at different things, but, you know, we've seen things like, you know, people putting out that, you know, you need to sterilize your groceries, or you need to worry about the guy that dogs past you without a mask on. And I think people are like, you know, in a panic about things that are, you know, that aren't really risky. And then there's things that, you know, like AIDS or COVID in the prison system and in nursing homes that are like huge problems, but they're not the ones people are looking at. So it would be, you know, it would be great to kind of try to look at the bigger picture and not just, you know, what am I worried about that might have some 0.000% risk right now, but what on the larger scale are the real risks that we need to address as a society. Not sure how to do that, but that's where I would focus.
Hotspots, basically. I mean, I think we have seen that there are areas, like there's a part of Brooklyn here where it's been really hard hit, and like there's one building in particular where several hundred people died. Nursing homes clearly have been a hotspot. And it seems fairly obvious to me that the places that you really want to have all the testing and contact tracing and all the PPE that you can possibly get should be focused on these hotspot areas and anyone who's visiting them. And I mean, there's so many obvious things that can be done. The fact that there's not PPE for everyone who needs a mask and gloves and a shield, whether they're delivering food or whatever they're doing, those we can see where the highest risk of death is. And there are very clear, obvious, and really very inexpensive interventions that we could be undertaking. And that's not just Trump, that's de Blasio and Cuomo too in my state.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's also, it's also individuals and activists. It's like people are worried about, what's happening immediately around them, but they're not thinking of, there are some people thinking like, we really need to address what's happening in the prisons and stuff. And most people are like, what do I think my neighbor isn't doing right? And I think there's, because I guess unlike HIV, it does sort of affect, everybody's at risk and you're at risk without knowing it. And I think that's hard for people to get their heads around.
Mm.
Yeah, so, we have a little bit of time left here. And I kind of do want to shift to sort of the second question that Jude gave us, because, we want to think a little bit about the future. And the way that we understand the future or the present is to look at the past. And so if you go back to yourself, when you got involved with AIDS work in the late 80s or early 90s, and you could go back to that person and advise what they might have done differently, knowing what you know now with respect to AIDS. Forget about COVID for a second. Knowing what you know now, what would you have done differently? What would you tell them? Look out for this because this is coming around the bend or whatever. Any thoughts on that? Matt?
So for me, that's really hard for me because if I would have done anything differently, it would have been to not be a sequential treater, sequential monotherapy treater, treating with one drug at a time.
Mm.
Okay, but that's a very specific issue. But that happened only because I was trying to survive and nobody knew the answer.
No, that's very interesting though. So you're talking about AZT, DDI, DDC, that sequence, and then...
Right, and I was smart enough to even know at that point that I shouldn't have started with AZT alone. So I waited until I could get a hold of DDC, which is the worst drug ever made.
Right.
And we were making it on the underground in bathtubs at the time. So I bought it to combine with AZT in the beginning. So I thought, oh, how great. AZT and DDC is going to help me. Well, of course it didn't. Then I moved to the next and the next and the next, adding a new drug to failed regimens, which was a recipe for disaster for me. And nothing changed until I got a hold of the integrase inhibitors, was able to construct a viable treatment regimen. But what I'm saying is that, yeah, sure, I would have done differently. Yeah. But we didn't know. Nobody knew. So well, it's like, what do we know that we don't know? I guess.
Yeah, right. Well, but that is very interesting. I think it was George that posted some article today, and I only got to the headline. Was it you that posted something from a Chinese newspaper talking about how there may be some way that the COVID virus is masking from the immune system in the same way that HIV
Jeff
did.
Posted that.
And so, maybe there is something, maybe a combination therapy is the thing to look at this point, and think about that in clinical trials. George.
I think that's fair.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's...
George, we were all so young and cute back in the 80s and 90s.
Not anymore, baby.
We still are. But...
No, thank you, yes.
But if you could go back...
I really don't know how to answer that question because possibly because the array of things I would like to have done differently. I think I wish I had been a little braver in working with intravenous drug users and needle exchange and things like that. But I was in the 80s. I was a punk and a performance artist and a junkie, and I was a little afraid to be around the needles again, thinking, am I going to do that again? In retrospect, I was done. I wasn't going to go back there. But I think that viral infections just generally, unless you get really lucky, like with Hep C. And that's, again, one of the reasons why I focused on treatment as a modality, because, you know, you actually can cure Hep C, and we don't have a vaccine for Hep C. Who cares? You basically take a couple of drugs for 12 weeks and 99% of people are going to be cured. And if you're not that round, you can take another, there's other options out there. It's just that they're hard to get because of the price. Though, you know, there's buyers clubs and things like that. I wish I'd been braver in getting involved with buyers clubs and finding, you know, making drugs. In fact, I wish that the buyers club that I was involved with it when the Hep C, this is more recent, that we'd actually started to bring in the generics right into this country, because that would have really been a poke in the eye to those bastards. And we actually did help other people who were doing it in the buyers club from Australia. But it's pretty clear to me that most of these interventions work better when you have a combination of approaches, when you're dealing with the underlying comorbidities, if there are any. With this one, I mean, we're seeing clearly that there's interventions like blood thinners could make a huge difference because of the clotting, because this virus is so damn weird, the things it does.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if we might get lucky and find, but it's even with the Hep C, it was 2 drugs. It's at least 2 drugs that you need in order to get rid of it. The nice thing about this virus, though, is it, like Hep C, it only gets into the cytoplasm and goes out. It's not like HIV where it gets into the genome. So maybe that's a reason to have a little hope for the future, that we can find treatments that will knock it down enough. But at the same time, I think we need to have those things like the vitamin D3 and the vitamin C and the NAC and the zinc, all those things that help keep the immune system from going haywire and throwing you into the cytokine storm. And I think some of those things, there's actually a number of studies in China and Korea where they looked at the traditional medicines and the herbs that they use. And some of those botanicals could also have an impact on mitigating progressive disease. We need to be able to have clinical trials of those kinds of interventions to get an evidence base to say, do they really work? We have preliminary data. We have actually some better preliminary data on some of those things than we do on remdesivir.
Liz, I remember I was writing at Project Inform fact sheets about, you know, the nucleosides and various alternative therapies back then, and you were writing for Beta and other at the AIDS Foundation and various other publications, and you've been consistently doing the same thing, you know, and branching out into cancer and now to COVID. So I don't know that you would do anything different. You just keep doing the thing.
Well, I'll tell you what I would do. You know, I already touched on it a bit, is, you know, I would have focused more on healthcare access. I think, you know, as HIV turned out, we've got fantastic drugs now. We've got a prevention pill, but the problem is, you know, a lot of people aren't using them. And why is that? It's socioeconomic reasons, it's lack of access to healthcare. And with COVID, with, you know, the fact that the comorbid conditions, you know, make the outcome so much poor. You know, maybe we can start addressing the comorbid conditions while we wait for, wait for a vaccine and treatment. But we can only do that if you know, people have access to pretty much routine healthcare, not just, you know, there's been various bills and such that, you know, you can get a COVID test, or, you know, they may have things that, you know, because of the political pressure that will make, you know, remdesivir available to the public for cheap, or the vaccine cheap. But it's only going to be those individual things. It's not going to be just saying, like, we need to just make healthcare accessible to everybody. And I think that's what's going to be needed to you know, deal with all these various health things. And there's just one other thing, I'll just make an observation, not necessarily about doing something differently, but I think HIV is, you know, it's a lifelong illness, and people become advocates, and it becomes kind of part of their identity if they're HIV positive. But with COVID, it's like it lasts for a month if you live and recover. And I don't know if we can expect to see people, other than those of us who are sort of in the field, becoming like COVID advocates, because, you know, once they've had COVID, They probably don't want to think about COVID anymore, and it's not going to be a long-term thing the same way.
Well,
Yeah.
some will. I mean, there's going to be that crew that survived events, and they're going to be looking at a year, 2 years of rehabilitation. And I'll just say Medicare for all. Biden needs to say Medicare for all.
Yeah.
Pelosi needs to say Medicare for all.
And I'm wondering, and I think it was Jeff that brought this up earlier, is the racial disparities. Liz, do you think that that's the differential access to healthcare and is the basis for the racial disparities in terms of?
I think that's a big part of it. It's like we know who doesn't have access to treatment. We know who doesn't have access to healthy food in their communities, and all of that adds up.
Yeah, yeah. Brenda.
Yeah, so what advice would we give to somebody working in the field, and what would I do differently? I guess I realized as you all were talking that I'm not really self-critical, and I wouldn't do a lot differently. I wear sunscreen more, but I
always thought you were pretty flawless, so
Thanks. What I learned, though, and I think what's important in it, is to keep an open mind. And the advice I would give people working on the front lines, sort of trying to figure out the contact tracing pieces, and working in a field where the information is old after 1 or 2 days or weeks, to not get stuck on the answer in front of you. And I think in HIV/AIDS, that was where conflict sometimes prevented us from fluidly moving into the next era of AIDS treatment, or seeing more clearly the advocacy we needed to be working on. Is if you get too invested with what you understand today, you can't really move fluidly into the future with new information. So keep an open mind. Even, I hear what George said about how we have so much information now, baseline information about alternative therapies, but none of that was controlled. None of what out of China was from controlled studies. And for people thinking about how to get involved, AIDS activists had to learn the importance of why it was important to have a controlled trial. So if you want to learn about that, that would be something important to understand, why you want to control a trial and compare something to something else. What I think—
double blind.
Yeah, and to go back to something Matt mentioned, what I think we have to continue to fall back on as activists, and I think the medical community, is we need to fall back on evidence-based medicine. When we get fearful, we grasp at straws and we want to try things to protect ourselves. And I would say I learned as an AIDS activist that when I saw people really going out on limbs, they probably caused more harm to themselves than good. And seeing someone take a risk can be very empowering, and it can say, I would be willing to take that risk for myself or my community. And that's got a role. Taking risks and being out there has a role. But when it comes down to what I think is fundamentally your day-to-day as a frontline worker, it's evidence-based medicine, evidence-based recommendations, and let people say what they want about hydroxychloroquine. Let's wait for the evidence and make evidence-based statements, and don't get too wrapped up in the fray of what people are saying works and doesn't work. Wait for the evidence. I think that's my key.
Okay. I'm going to have to say that there's so much more for us to talk about, and I really apologize that we're out of time. And say, I do want to mention that in July there's this thing. It was going to be the International AIDS Conference on the 30th anniversary of the conference in San Francisco. It's now going to be online. There's going to be a one-day conference associated with that, looking at COVID-19. I'm sure, Liz, you'll be covering it. Yep. And in conjunction with that, I know we're going to do some programming. I'd love to have you all back. Brenda, is curating our an exhibition looking at the history of AIDS treatment activism. I think primarily through the lens of Northern California, but sorry, George. You know, there's a story here that I think that often gets lost in the narrative in terms of our involvement from the West Coast in treatment and research activism. And so I'm really happy that that's going to be happening, and it's going to be online, of course. And please, for those who are watching, go to glbthistory.org, look at our other programming, click on Donate Now, and become a member of the Historical Society. I really appreciate all of you being with us tonight. Matt, I'm with you. We're all angry and we're all scared, and you know, we're going to get through this, and keep yourself safe. And love you all. Thank you all for your work, and wash your hands.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you and Leigh for setting it up.
Yay.
Yes,
Yay,
love you all.
thanks, Leigh.
Love you all. Thank you.
All right. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.